Chapter 5. Two men, one short, the other tall, who might have been dressed in brown, the street was too dark to be sure, saw Smith hurry out of the Red Lion Tavern. They'd been in a doorway nearby, deep in shadows. They did not think they'd been observed. After a few seconds, they set off together in the wake of the hurrying boy. They followed him for about 5 minutes along the nearly empty Saffron Hill. Then they lost him. He seemed to have vanished into the gloomy air. Half a minute later, he was seen unexpectedly on their left at the corner of Cross Street, hurrying like a mad thing. They nodded and set off again. This time, they kept him in sight for nearly 10 minutes. Then he vanished near Coney Court. They waited a while, listening, for the narrow streets and alleys hereabouts were very quiet, and even a rat scuttle would have been heard. Now they entered the shadowy confines of the court, were about 3 yards within it, when the boy was seen again, darting desperately back across Cross Street, his alarmed eyes glittering in the light of some late merchant's window. Back went the two followers, their shoulders hunched, for the night was growing bitter by the minute, and they kissed their feet kissing the cobbles with a grim, urgent passion. They did not let him out of their sight for more than an instant. Portpool Lane, Hatton Garden, Chart Street, back into Saffron Hill, then Holborn Hill, Union Court, Hatton Garden again, and so to Cross Street, Saffron Hill, Cox's Court. An intricate necklace of flight was being threaded as the three scurrying figures shifted through and around the lanes, courts, and alleys that lay ragged and near deserted under a gnawed rind of the moon. Sometimes there was not about 5 yards between them. Then they'd lose him for a few seconds, oddly, unaccountably, like he'd gone in a puff of black smoke, till there he'd be again, come suddenly from dark passageway of which nothing he had been seen till then. There seemed to be many dozens of these crevices in the black, lumpy substance of the frowning houses, but sooner or later there'd be one whose end would be sewn up tight as a sock, a fatal passage from which there'd be no panting scuttle of escape. The boy had left the Red Lion Tavern at 6:30 by St. Paul's. At 8:45, their followers leaned up against a wall in Hatton Garden. Breathed one, "For goodness sake, I can't go on another step. Me heart'll burst, I swear it," came a low reply, much charged with pain and phlegm. "All right, we'll go back somehow to the Red Lion. We'll wait there. God rot the crafty little perisher." With painful steps they limped away, so wind-broken by 2¼ hours of unceasing pursuit that they seemed scarce able to drag their own meagre shadows down the cold street. 10 minutes later, in a narrow abutment, no more than a yard from where they'd been leaning, a shadow moved. Then a face edged out, a small, pointed, wary face. It surveyed the empty street. It grinned, not with pleasure, but with a savage and desperate triumph. Smith had done what he'd set out to do when he'd seen the men waiting for him as he left the Red Lion. He'd run his pursuers into the ground. He began to walk, somewhat slowly, for his own sides were aching villainously. Presently he stopped and drew the sweat-drenched document from under his coat. He studied it by the thin, cold light of the moon. It did not seem much the worse for its wedding. Miss Bridget's property and Miss Fanny's felonious looked as much like a horse and a cart and a nest of maggots as ever. Nonetheless, at the first opportunity, he picked a passing pocket of a handkerchief and wrapped the document up. Then he sighed with relief and set off for another part of town. Though no one followed him now, he moved with extraordinary circumspection, for the dark houses in the dimly silvered streets held another more formidable menace. Time and again he fancied he heard other footsteps, steps that limped awkwardly, and he thought of the unseen lame man with a soft voice. But these alarms were in his mind alone, and if they ever came to anything, they never turned into more than the totterings of some drunken homegoer or the limping of a chairman, weary unto death and cursing under his breath. Now he was in high Holborn, and the tall buildings on either side scoured blackly down with here and there through an ill-drawn drape, a yellow sneer of light, while ceaselessly down the wide street, like the devil's own crossing sweeper, came a bitter wind, whipping up the town's rubbish into spiteful ghosts of dust and paper that plucked and nipped and stung the living boy. His nose, chin and fingers were beginning to burn with the cold. Not a night to be out in, black and windy, with the moon now doused in the creeping sea of cloud. He passed by a gloomy alehouse with a bunch of iron grapes groaning from its sign. He stopped, fingered a guinea he'd got with the handkerchief, and thought of a bed for the night. But the house was full, so he took half a pint of gin to keep out the cold, the loneliness and the shifting fear to no purpose. The gin sickened him and inflamed his brain, so he's heard everywhere the soft voice he dreaded, an awkward scrape of a leg, quaintly lame. He began to search for the door and was helped by a pair of potboys who came at him, slantwise from somewhere in the smoky room. Out again into the bitter street. Above his head, the iron grapes creaked menacingly, back and forth, back and forth. He moved away, fearful that they'd drop and crack him like an egg. But it was not the grapes alone. The very houses seemed to be shuddering against the blotched sky. He shifted out into the middle of the street, for he'd a sudden horror that all the tall buildings were tottering in upon him. The sky seemed to grow smaller and smaller, and the jagged roofs, fanged with chimneys, seemed to snarl and snap as if to gobble him up. He began to run wildly now from side to side of the street, banging into posts, stumbling across the gutter, turning down lanes and alleys they were new even to him, and all this with a curious, hopeless urgency, his feet running like a hanged man's feet, seeming to reach for a purchase on a world that was slipping away. Where was he going? Who knew? Maybe even in search of the two men in brown to give up the document, for suddenly it seemed to him that the document was a fearful disease that was burning and poisoning him after tempting him madly from the shelter of his home. At last, he found himself in a long, wide street where the moon had widowed all the houses with black hatchments under their porches. Vaguely, he thought he knew where he was. There was a narrow turning any minute now, an alleyway that would lead him deviously back to the Red Lion. He fancied he saw it. He turned. Watch out! Watch out! Oh, ah! At this very moment, Smith had turned into the alley. A gentleman had come out of it. They met, and though the gentleman was tall and stout and huge beside Smith, he was struck with such speed and force that he fell with an angry, frightened cry. Smith struggled to his feet, was about to rush on, when a hand grasped his ankle. "Let go," he shouted. "Damn you, no! Help me first!" Smith glared wildly down. He saw the gentleman's face grey as a puddle. His eyes were sunken and dark, no spark of light in them. Help me up, I say, for pity's sake, sir. Can't you see I'm blind?" "A blind man?" gasped Smith. "Oh, no, a man in the hole. A mole in the hole, sorry." The gin's tempest dropped abruptly away and left a glum wreckage behind, bleak and forlorn in the freezing night. "A boy, a child," thought the blind man uneasily. "Most likely a young thief. Most likely he'll rob me and run off, frightened out of his miserable wits. Oh, no! How am I going to get home?" "If you let go me ankle," muttered Smith, "I'll help you up. That's if you're really blind. Can you see me?" The gentleman shook his head. "What am I going to do now? What am I doing now?" asked Smith, pulling a hideous face. I don't know. I swear I'm blind. Look at my eyes. Any light in them? Look for my smoked spectacles. They're somewhere about. Look for... What am I doing now?" demanded Smith, pulling another, even more monstrous face for he'd help no one who didn't need it. The blind man loosed his hold on Smith's ankle and heaved himself up on one elbow. He'd lost his hat, and his wig was awry, but Otherwise, he'd suffer no harm. He began to fill the adjacent cobbles for his possessions. Smith watched him as his face returned to normal, but as a last measure, he fished inside his coat and pulled out the document. "What have I got in me hand?" he asked gruffly. The blind man sighed. "My life, my boy, my life's in your hand." Smith scowled and put away the document. "Here you are, Mr. Mole in the Hole. Here's me, and then up with you, up on your pins, and here's your hat and stick and black spectacles, though why you wears 'em foxes me. But you're a real giant of a gent. Did you know it?" This last as the blind man stood up and fairly towered over the helpful Smith. "Thank you, boy. Now tell me, if I'm in the street or the alley, I'll give you a guinea for your pains." "You're in the corner. Facing which way?" "The Lord knows. I've been sick myself." "Fever? Half a pint of gin." Suddenly, Smith felt a strong desire to confide in the blind man. After all, it could do no harm. "Smith," he said. He held out one hand to be shook, while the other he guided the blind man to meet it. "Smith, hunted, wounded, homeless, and part gin-sodden. Smith, 12 years old, that's me. Very small but wiry, as they say. Dark-haired, and lately residing in the Red Lion Tavern of Saffron Hill." Smith. Helplessly, the blind man smiled, and his questing hand grasped Smith firmly. "Mansfield," he said. "Blind as a wall for these past 12 years. Well-to-do, but not much enjoying it. Mansfield, residing at number 7 Vine Street under the care of a daughter. Mansfield, believe it or not, a magistrate." "What?" gasped Smith. "Who'd have thought I'd be ever shaking hands with a bleeding justice?" If Mr. Mansfield heard, he was too gentlemanly to remark on it. Instead, he fumbled in his coat for the promised guinea. "And now, just point me toward the church that should stand at one end of the